Well, hey guys, the video for today, the topic we're going to discuss is going to be gun violence or gun laws and domestic violence. The reason that I'm making this video today is I saw a press conference the other day with the city of Columbus, basically the entire city leadership team. The mayor was there, the city attorney was there, the chief of police was there, city council president was there, and a bunch of other people. I watched most of it. I didn't watch the entire thing. I have it saved on my computer. I'm going to watch more of it later. But there was something that I saw that really caught my eye because it was, what's the word I'm looking for? Bullshit. The person who was talking was spreading bullshit all over the place. And I don't appreciate it when people do that. It was 100% a political speech and politically driven. And that annoys me because what we're talking about here is people dying. We're talking about different people's rights as far as their firearm rights and stuff, but we're more importantly, we're talking about people getting murdered on the streets and how to control that. And I don't appreciate local politicians making this a political type thing with all the blaming and all that other stuff. So one thing that I saw was the Columbus city attorney. His name is Zach Klein. I don't have it written down, but I'm pretty sure that's his name. I don't I don't know how he got elected. He got elected because some people were told to vote for him. And boom, he's the city attorney for the city of Columbus. I'm going to play the video for you here in just 1 second. But when he goes on to this little tirade about how we're trying to stop all these murders from happening. And one thing that is unfortunate is that state lawmakers who just happen to be Republican, it was mentioned multiple times through multiple speakers, that they are failing to make a law prohibiting people who have been convicted of domestic violence from owning a firearm. So what he does, he goes and touts how the city of Columbus has an ordinance that makes it a misdemeanor offense to possess a firearm if you've been convicted of domestic violence. And he talks about how the only way to bring these kinds of people to justice is by using federal attorneys. So he goes on this little thing. Let's watch that video now.
When the city council and the mayor and the city attorney's office passed some of its more recent gun laws, namely the weapons under disability law as it relates to those who have a domestic violence conviction, there was a gap between the federal level that prohibits individuals with a domestic violence conviction from possessing a gun and the state level, which in a state like Ohio allows a person with a domestic violence conviction to possess a gun. We stepped in the gap to create a city ordinance that prohibits a domestic violent offender conviction from possessing a gun. And the reason we did that is because the federal level, the federal government did not have the resources to prosecute some of the worst domestic violence offenders who possess guns.
Okay, so there was city attorney Zach Klein talking about the importance of bringing people to justice who have been convicted of domestic violence and are in possession of a firearm. He thinks that this is going to be the solution to the murder problem in Columbus, Ohio. Well, there's a couple of things to that. First of all, I'm not so confident that the majority of the people committing these murders, because there's a lot of murders being committed by 14, 15, 16-year-olds, I don't think they've had the opportunity to be convicted of domestic violence. I think that this is just another circumstance where politicians are trying to, they're picking things out of the air that will sound really good in a soundbite, but in actuality, they don't make a goddamn bit of difference. They know that, but they're still going to spread that bullshit around. So I went ahead and did a little research, and well, this is something that I know. Domestic violence is something that I take very seriously. It's an issue that means a lot to me. I deal with domestic violence victims a lot, and a lot of the domestic violence victims I've spoken to recently have been telling me that they are receiving pressure from the city attorney's office, pressure to allow them to dismiss some of these domestic violence cases or to accept a plea other than domestic violence in their case. Now, gun laws are one aspect of a domestic violence conviction. Also, it can affect you getting a job in the future. If you're convicted of domestic violence, there's a lot of jobs that you have a background check, you cannot have that job. There's a lot of other consequences. One of the other important ones from my perspective is that if I arrest, let's call him John, for domestic violence, he sucker punches his wife, gives her a black eye. They go to court. He's found guilty of domestic violence and he agrees to go to counseling. Jane decides to let him move back in. Everything is all hunky-dory for about 2 years. And then 2 years later, he gets mad because his mashed potatoes aren't hot enough, sucker punches her in the face again, gets arrested. And that time he can be charged with a felony. So it's important. One of the things that I discuss a lot with domestic violence victims is please, please, please follow through with this. Let us get a domestic violence conviction out of this case. That way, if he does this again to you or does it to another person, we can charge him with a felony and hopefully we can get that violent, disgusting, filthy person off the streets. But unfortunately, the city attorney's office, which is run by Zach Klein, who's complaining that gun laws currently in the state of Ohio allow domestic violence people who have been convicted to own a firearm. He's making a big point that, you know, those people are allowed to carry a firearm and that's the reason our society is so dangerous. The question I have is, why is his office not pushing harder to get convictions in more domestic violence cases? Why are they going to victims and saying, listen, we don't want to take this to trial. Let's offer them a plea. And what we'll do is we'll let them plead to something else other than domestic violence, because they don't want to have that domestic violence conviction on their record. This way you get a guilty plea, they'll get some very serious probation, and then everybody can move on with their lives. This is something that's happening daily. And it took me 10 minutes to find a handful of cases. If I had a couple hours, I could probably get 1,000 cases for you. I want to show you what this looks like. So here is a domestic violence case. This guy named Corley Hackney. I found these simply because I know a lot of Columbus police officers. So I was able to go into the court system, search by officer, and I just started reading all of their cases. And I saved the ones that were domestic violence cases where they were found guilty in lieu of. And I wanted to explain what is happening in our courts so that you can better understand. So this guy, Corley Hackney, that's his name, right? Yeah, Corley Hackney. So here's his charges. Domestic violence knowingly caused physical harm. That was dismissed. But the assault, he was found guilty. So the charge of domestic violence in the state of Ohio is knowingly cause or attempt to cause physical harm to another household or family member. Family or household member. I can't remember the exact wording, but that's the gist of it. So if you commit the act of assault on a family or household member, you have now committed the act of domestic violence. This guy was charged with domestic violence, but he was convicted of assault. Does that mean that they couldn't prove that this was a family or household member? I find that to be quite unlikely. This means that they didn't want to go to trial and they got the guy to take a plea to an assault charge rather than a domestic violence charge. Here's another one. These are all from 2020. Willie Bliss. Let's see. Willie Bliss was charged with aggravated menacing, domestic violence menacing. So this was the domestic violence threats law in the state of Ohio is cause a family or household member to believe that they are at risk of serious physical harm and that harm is imminent. So that means that Jane called the police and said, John has a gun. He's threatening to kill me. Please come and arrest John. So the officers came. They arrested John, or Willie in this case. They charged him with domestic violence threats that charge was dismissed, and he was allowed to plead guilty to aggravated menacing. Aggravated menacing is the same as domestic violence threats, although it doesn't have to be a family or household member. And it also does not carry the penalties that a domestic violence conviction carries. So the city attorney's office is offering plea deals to people to allow them to avoid domestic violence convictions. Are you following along with what I'm saying here? Here's another one. Oh, this guy is Luis. He was charged with violation of a protection order. Oh, this one is interesting because a lot of times domestic or protection orders are often granted out of domestic violence incidences. So he was charged with violating a protection order. We put these in place so that if John beats Jane and Jane kicks him out of the house, gets a protection order, he's not allowed within 500 feet of her. He's not allowed to call her. He's not allowed to show up at the kid's school. He's not allowed to do any of these things. If he does, we will arrest him. We have these laws to protect our victims, to make our victims feel safe. This guy was arrested for violating his protection order, but he was allowed to plead guilty to an amended offense, which was an attempt to commit offense. So he was charged with a misdemeanor 1, misdemeanor in the first degree, the highest degree misdemeanor in the state of Ohio, and he was allowed to plead guilty to an M2, which is a lesser offense. Again, this most likely stems out of a domestic violence case. He probably has a domestic violence conviction, and he's harassing his victim, was charged. Instead of going to trial, they just gave him an attempt. Doesn't mean they couldn't prove the first case, just means that's the deal that they gave him. Again, this is all Zach Klein's office offering these people plea deals to avoid domestic violence convictions. These are the convictions that he is saying we need to make sure people who are convicted of domestic violence can't carry a gun. But what is he doing to make sure that people are actually convicted of domestic violence? Let's see, here's another one. Jonathan Carpenter. Let's scroll down. Domestic violence knowingly cause harm, and assault, aggravated menacing, domestic violence threats. He pled guilty to an amended charge of criminal mischief. Criminal mischief is not domestic violence. This conviction would not prevent him from owning a firearm. I've got a bunch of these guys. Michael somebody. I didn't read these before. I just kind of found the ones. Let's see. Menacing and domestic violence threats. So another domestic violence relationship. He threatened to hurt somebody in a very serious way. They allowed him to plead guilty to disorderly conduct. This is not a charge that would prohibit him from owning a firearm. He would still pass a national firearms background check with this conviction. Because we did mention before that you are not allowed to own a firearm nationally if you have a guilty conviction of domestic violence. So another thing that this does is if you make these guys plead to guilty or you take it to trial and you actually get a conviction on a domestic violence case, when they go to a gun store to buy a firearm and that background check is submitted, they will fail their background check because they've been found guilty of domestic violence. But for some reason, the people who are demanding that we keep guns out of the hands of domestic violence perpetrators, they are not making sure these people are found guilty of domestic violence. They're offering them plea deals to get out of that charge. Here's another one. Brian Elkins. Charged with domestic violence. He was able to plead guilty to criminal mischief. Russell Turnbull, something like that. Aggravated menacing, assault, menacing by stalking. That's interesting. Guilty to an amended charge of an attempt to commit assault. All right, this one might not have actually been a domestic violence case, but he was charged with stalking, which was dismissed. That's interesting. That one kind of slipped by. Didn't mean to add that one. Brian Green. What are his charges? Domestic violence, assault. So knowingly cause or attempt to cause physical harm to a family or household member. It's domestic violence. They got him for assault, cause or attempt to cause physical harm to another. It was out of a domestic violence case. If they had gone for the domestic violence conviction, this guy would be prohibited from owning a firearm federally, as well as he could be charged at a state level. And if he got arrested and charged again, he can be charged with a felony domestic violence case, which carries much greater sentences. Who else do we have? Ben Iman. Did I already read this one? Looks familiar. Domestic violence, criminal mischief. Cortez Jones. He was charged with aggravated menacing and domestic violence threats. He was allowed to plead guilty to disorderly conduct. Again, these are charges that would not prohibit him from owning a firearm. This is in the hands of the city attorney's office. This is the city prosecutor. He has the ability to make sure that he fights for these cases, to make sure that these people are convicted of domestic violence so that the firearms laws will apply. Right now, what he's doing is he's saying, oh no, why won't the state pass a law prohibiting somebody with a domestic violence charge from owning a firearm? He's bemoaning the lawmakers for not passing that law, but at the same time, he's not doing anything to make sure that these people are actually held responsible for the charges that are brought before them. I know this to be a fact because I talk to victims all the time. I know the amount of pressure that they're under, and it's shameful that you're going to look at a woman who had to call the police because she was in fear for her life, that her husband had a gun, was threatening to kill her, and they allow him to plead to an amended charge that has nothing to do with domestic violence. He gets unreporting probation for 9 months, and he walks out of that courtroom thinking that he won. And then he's charged again out of another incident, and again, they're pressuring this victim into letting him plea to something other than domestic violence. And then you're going to go out there and whine and bitch that there's no law preventing domestic violence offenders from carrying firearms. You need to do your job in the first place and make sure that these offenders are convicted of the appropriate charge. These victims deserve that kind of treatment. That's not what you're doing. You're just out there saying it's someone else's fault. So what's this one? This last one, I saved this for last. It's the best. This is Brian Gill. He was charged with the city version of carrying a weapon after being convicted of domestic violence. This is what the city attorney was just up there touting. He was saying, hey, listen, the state of Ohio didn't write this law, so we're going to write this law. We're going to make sure that these guys face justice, they get serious time, blah, 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 all of these things. He pled guilty to an amended charge. He was charged with an M1. It's not written there, but it's an M1. And he got downgraded to an M2. He got 90 days suspended and 90 days in jail. That's not serious time. They could have put him in jail for up to a year under the city code. Why didn't they do that? You're going to sit up there and you're going to piss and bitch and moan that there's no state law that allows you to put people in jail for any serious time. You're going to say that you have to send 2 attorneys to the U.S. District Attorney's Office, whatever, so that they can charge them federally so that these guys can be put in prison for longer sentences. But when you have the opportunity to do so, you're not doing it. I have a problem with that. It's called bullshit. And the reason that you're getting away with it is because you're talking to people that don't understand how the process works. Well, I do know how the process works. And unfortunately for you, the internet exists. And I get to show this stuff to everybody. I also want to just take a moment to mention, while we're on the subject, that this is the same city attorney that in the summer of 2020 had over 2,000 cases dismissed in the interest of justice. A lot of these cases were the rioters that were destroying buildings and everything downtown. A lot of them were completely unrelated to the riots. There were some people who were resisting arrest and fighting with police officers and a lot of that kind of stuff. Those cases were all dismissed in the name of justice. And now we have this crime wave that everyone's trying to figure out how to solve. And they're all blaming everybody else for not doing their job. Well, the first person that you need to blame is yourself. You're the one that's not doing your job. And that has a cascade effect that's affecting everybody else. So before you start pissing and moaning that the state doesn't have a law prohibiting people who are found guilty of domestic violence from owning a firearm, maybe you should do your part and make sure people are actually convicted of domestic violence when they're brought in front of a judge on your jurisdiction. I know here's the thing is that as a police officer, if I go to a household where probable cause exists that I can determine the primary physical aggressor in a domestic violence situation, I am required by law to make an arrest in that situation. If I fail to do so, I will lose my job and I might go to prison. But for some reason, when these guys go to court, there's nothing wrong with offering them some sweet deal that doesn't include domestic violence, even though you know these guys are pieces of shit. I don't like bullshit. So I'll point it out when I see it. So those are going to be my thoughts for today. I'll talk to you guys soon.